Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name is Brian, and this video is going to continue my series on faction identity in 2021 for A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game. This video specifically is going to be looking into the Lannisters. So from carrying over still, the Lannisters focus on two zones like most of the other factions in the game, and that's going to be the wealth and the crown. So to give maybe just a brief introduction to this series, if you're a Lannister-only player and you haven't checked out any of the other videos that I've done for this, essentially what I'm going to be doing is going through the tactics deck to kind of take a look at what I think the faction identity for this particular faction is going to be going into the 2021 update. And I'm going to go ahead and give you kind of my overall thoughts right away, and then we'll dig into those tactics cards to kind of show you exactly why I think the way that I do. So the Lannisters still focus on the two zones that they've been focusing on since they first started. That's going to be the wealth and the crown. Typically, your cards are going to get better when you play them if you have one of those zones, typically. So the gist with Lannisters is they've always kind of had this sense of control about them, and maybe it's just that, maybe I didn't focus on it too much when I was playing with them, because the Lannisters are probably not my favorite faction to play, so I don't dig into them too much. But with the update, I feel like the Lannisters have kind of gone more towards, they've kind of pointed their control a little bit in terms of just kind of being this political and fear-mongering faction. They kind of control the battlefield through trying to put some pressure on your opponent's units, whether that be causing them to fail panic tests, to run away from the battlefield, or join your cause, or trying to shift the affiliation of your opponent's NCUs to kind of work for you. So that's kind of, if we were to kind of pin down the exact faction identity for the Lannisters, it would be control through political power. If that kind of, I know that's kind of hard to translate into the game because political means so many different things. But for this, we're going to be really focusing on a lot of those unit abilities, panic tests, and things like that. So let's just dig into the cards and see if we can kind of, or see if I can kind of put more sense to what I'm thinking about. So the first card we come across is Intrigue and Subterfuge. This card triggers when an enemy NCU activates. That enemy NCU loses all abilities until the end of the round, and if you happen to control the wealth zone, target one enemy combat unit, that enemy becomes weakened. So when I talk about the Lannister cards, there's a lot of coloring that goes on with them. So the Intrigue and Subterfuge is kind of like, as a Lannister player, you're kind of dangling some kind of, deal in front of someone's NCU, your opponent's NCU, to try and get them to stop doing something to help kind of forward the army's victory or position in the game. And if you happen to have that wealth zone, it's almost like you're distracting them really well, and then that while you're trying to get the attention of that NCU, you're weakening one of the combat units on the table, because maybe that NCU had to do something really important and they just dropped the ball or something. So like maybe that's me, maybe I'm forging the narrative a little too hard on that one, but essentially this card just shuts your opponent's NCU down that you want. Especially you want to target the ones that have those really good, like when they claim the zone they do a thing ability. Or if they happen to have influence, you can kind of shut that down for a turn, especially if your opponent's really like leaning on it in order to try and gain some kind of position in the game that puts them closer to claiming victory. And then having that wealth zone just means that not only did you kind of, shut down this NCU for a turn, but you also made one of your opponent's combat units less effective in the game. And for Lannisters, that's really quite nice, because you do have pretty decent defensive stats, but any kind of advantage you can press in the game is going to be really important for them, and making sure your units stick around longer is going to make it so that you'll want to have the coin zone pretty much whenever you play this. Next up, we have a Lannister pays his debts. This triggers at the start of any turn. You target one friendly combat unit and attach this card to them until the end of the game. When a friendly infantry or cavalry unit is destroyed, you can put an order token on this card. And then while this card has a token, the attached unit's melee attacks gain vicious, and while you control the crown, they gain +1 to hit. So a Lannister Pays His Debts was an interesting card in the 1.6 version, and I do try not to compare these too much as they shift over, but I think this one in particular is really worth outlining because there are a lot of cards like this that have had a change very similar to a Lannister Pays His Debts, but you know, the Lannisters, they like having the wealth zone and keeping their units fresh, you know, things like using other tactics cards and other strategies to keep units nice and full. You didn't really want to ever have any of your units being destroyed on your opponent's terms. You know, you wanted to make sure that happened on yours. And a Lannister Pays His Debts as a card that sat in your hand until the unit was destroyed. It would get a little clunky, and you might be clogging your hand up with this card. But now you can just put this on a unit and kind of make it so that it's either a unit that you want to protect or a unit that is going to be playing in that backfield, or maybe even one that's just super survivable and you don't worry about losing it in the near future anyways. And then that way, when you do happen to lose a unit, you don't have to worry about this card having clogged up your hand the whole time. And then your opponent has a lot to think about. This is kind of a little more playing into this idea that the Lannisters like to kind of confound your opponent in some of the things that they do. Putting this card down on a unit means that your opponent is going to have to understand that if they take a unit out of the game before this particular Pays His Debts unit has activated, they're going to have a rough time if that unit is ready to get a charge on something or is engaged in a combat where vicious and +1 to hit would really end up pushing them over the edge of being able to do more work to that unit than what they would normally. So you can kind of manipulate the way your opponent reacts to the table by having this on there right away early, because they know that if they do something like that, they could be paying for it pretty harshly. The next card we have up here is the Lannister's namesake card, Hear Me Roar. When an enemy is performing a morale test before dice are rolled is when this card happens to trigger, and that enemy then suffers -1 to the roll and an additional -1 for each of their destroyed ranks. On a failure, they suffer 1 wound or +1 wound for the failed panic test. So in 1.6, this card was definitely a pretty big bugbear for a lot of folks. It was typically something you would see happen if somebody took Cersei, grabbed the crown, zapped you with a -3, then they'd hit you with the Hear Me Roar, and if they had that crown zone, of course, because that's how they triggered the panic test, they would panic you as well. It was just a way to do a really huge panic test on a unit and kind of ensure that they were going to fail. Now it hasn't shifted a whole bunch here. It's still doing what it did before, where they're suffering that -1, but then if they're a unit that's under full strength, they're already kind of cowering under the power of the Lannisters, right? So they'll be suffering an additional 1 for each one of those ranks that's down. So this is definitely a card you might want to hold towards that mid-game to try and help push some more pressure when you might maybe running out of resources or something like that. You no longer have to have a zone in order to make this card better. It more kind of it pumps itself up based off of them having destroyed ranks. And then they also get to suffer an additional wound for having this played, so it kind of brings back what the panic test used to be, where it was failing, it was a D3 +1. So this still puts a lot of pressure on someone for making sure that their panic tests are, you know, being passed regularly, but you know, they're going to suffer quite a bit for losing this. And the Lannister stuff in general isn't the most aggressive in terms of being able to put out a bunch of fighting power. They have units that do it, but not compared to some of those other more combat focused armies out there. Hear Me Roar is just a good way to try and tip the scales on a unit that is on its way out, and when you just need a little bit more gas to kind of steamroll right over them. Next up is a new card for the Lannisters, and that's Bribery. This triggers when a friendly NCU activates or claims a zone, you replace that zone's effect with target 1 enemy combat unit and attach the Bribery card to them until they pass a morale test or are targeted by the wealth zone. While attached, this unit's attacks using its lowest attack die value. So that one was a mouthful. I don't know why that was so hard to get out, but essentially, this is just a fun way to alter some of the things that your NCUs do. You can do this really early in the game if you're expecting to get engaged by some unit that's kind of a bit of a combat monster but has a sharp decay value. You just get to take a zone, exchange the ability for it to make it so that this unit's not going to be doing much until it passes a morale test or is targeted by the coin. Now, it's very likely that this card is not going to be around on a unit very long if your opponent's bringing high morale stuff into your Lannister list, because typically it's kind of the way people react to Lannisters to say, okay, well, my morale is going to be messed with, so I need to bring, you know, better units. But if you happen to have a unit that is altering some of that when they attack, as long as they keep failing those morale tests, this card's going to stay on them. And as a Lannister player, you're going to want the coin or the wealth zone anyways, so I could even, I imagine most of the times you play Bribery are going to be either after the wealth zone has been taken and maybe your opponent fills a unit back up that that needed to get up those extra wounds in order to do some work in combat. Then you can just kind of flop this down and surprise them out of nowhere and make sure that that unit that they thought was going to do a bunch of work now isn't. And if that unit happens to be lower morale stat, or you're able to modify that a little bit, you're going to make sure that Bribery stays on and they kind of become really ineffective over the long run of the game. This is just a really cool flavor play. It's not just a good card, but like I said, it's really good flavor-wise because you're kind of you know, letting the narrative play out on the table of the Lannister NCU kind of running out and telling a unit to just not be as good as it normally would be by just giving them some money. And in order for your opponent to get that back, to get that efficacy back, they need to target them with the coin zone, or somehow the innate, you know, the moral compass of that unit needs to line back up to fight for the cause that they originally came there for. I think this is a really cool card, and you know, it's going to be fun to start playing with this one in a Lannister-based list. The next card we have coming up is one that I think causes most people to twitch when they hear the name of it, and that's Counterplot. This triggers when an opponent plays a tactics card before resolving that card. You roll a die, and on a 3+, you cancel the effects of that tactics card, and if you happen to control the crown, you can re-roll this die. Now, this card has changed 0 from what I remember. You know, I'm looking at it now, and I'm thinking about Counterplot, and I don't think this card has changed in any way, shape, or form. It's still a phenomenal card. This is why a lot of people kind of stapled the control label onto the Lannister faction, because this Counterplot card works very much like how Magic's Counterspell worked. And whenever you play this, you've got your 3+, or your, what is it, a 66% chance that you're going to be able to stop the opponent's tactics card that they play, especially if this is like going to be a card that really rubber bands them back into a game, or put some more pressure on you when you've already kind of been down, and you get the chance to stop that. Now, when you re-roll that, I'm not the greatest when it comes to statistics with dice, but I believe that probably kicks you back up to maybe like an 85% chance that you're going to be able to stop this one. So it always is, it's never any fun when you end up failing the roll on Counterplot, because you do feel like you kind of wasted the play. But the amount of value you gain out of just being able to stop a tactics card out of nowhere is a really big deal for the Lannister faction, and of course your opponent's going to be hurt by it quite a bit. And it's worth mentioning right now that this card gets a little bit more value in the Lannisters when you start playing with like Tyrion Lannister as an NCU, because he has a once per game ability to go fetch out Counterplot for you, and that makes it so that he's extremely dangerous, and your opponent's going to really need to be thinking a lot about how to play around that. And it's just more of this, the Lannisters really force your opponent to have to think about things, knowing that you have these capabilities to really kind of hinder their stuff. So sometimes you're doing more damage with the threat of something like Counterplot than you are with the actual card. Next up, we have another legacy card, and this is Fealty to the Crown. This triggers when an enemy fails a panic test. You target one friendly unit within long range, and for each wound that enemy suffered from the test, you restore 1 wound to that friendly unit up to 3. And then if you control the crown, you get an additional +1 to get to a maximum of 4 restored wounds. So Fealty to the Crown altered just a little bit in the change, but this card essentially still does the same thing. Your opponent fails a morale test, and all those warriors or soldiers that are running away are going to then join one of the Lannister units and kind of switch to the winning side, so to speak. So this card is not one that your opponent really can plan around so much, but just know they'll know that it's there, and even if they're doing things like taking that wealth zone away from you so you're not able to kind of refuel your ranks, you still have fealty to the crown to back up your, or to at least try and get yourself a little bit of extra wounds and some more sustain, and your opponent is likely going to be failing panic tests for most of the game, so you can kind of hold this to make sure that that panic test is going to be worth it, so you're throwing the maximum amount of wounds into a unit. And with this being long range and the way that Ice and Fire is played on a 4x4, it's pretty likely that you'll have ample opportunity to get full use out of this and put the wounds back into a unit that really need it. The final card in the Lannister Tactics deck is Subjugation of Power, and this triggers when an enemy combat unit activates. That enemy performs one morale test, and then for each zone you control among the crown and the wealth, they suffer -2 to that roll. On a failure, until the end of the turn, they can't be targeted by friendly tactics cards and lose all their abilities. Subjugation of Power is kind of a evolution of Paid Mutiny. So Paid Mutiny before was quite harsh in what it could do to a unit. Not only did you lose your abilities, but you lost wounds for it too, and it was just, if you did your D3, and if you happened to have the crown, I believe, or the coin, I can't remember which one it was you needed to have in order to get it to be a bigger deal, but instead of suffering D3 wounds, you suffered 3 flat. But the current version of it, or at least the evolved version of it in Subjugation of Power, is still quite effective. It's an extremely control-y card, and if you have one of the 2 zones that you're going to be wanting to have anyways as a Lannister player, they're still going to suffer that -2 regardless of which one you have. And if you are pretty lucky and your opponent's giving you both of these zones, they would suffer -4 to that, and that's pretty hard for a lot of units to pass, even the ones that have really good morale. And failing it just is pretty harsh too. This is another one of those things where, like, it's a very reactive card, so if your opponent is getting ready to kind of charge into you with a unit that's supposed to be doing a lot of work, and maybe they've got some tactics cards that they want to play on it as well, you just trigger or slap down this card, and then that kind of makes it so the opponent, they have to activate the unit that they chose, but they aren't going to be as effective with it, and sometimes they might not even be able to get anywhere with it because one of their cards might have been something that did, like, extended their threat or made it so that their charge was a little bit more guaranteed. Think about all of the new cards that we have that are like, I think it's Devastating Impact is the one that or Rush of Aggression. I can't remember which one of those cards it was that ends up counting as you rolling a 6 on the charge distance. Sometimes people are going to go for those long bomb charges as long as they have that card in their hand because they know they're going to make it. But now with Subjugation of Power, they're going to have to think twice because there's a lot of, like, losing an early activation like that and just letting the Lannister opponent do whatever they want to with the next turn and maybe start those engagements a little bit more on their terms is going to be pretty harsh for opponents to kind of bounce back from. So if they're not taking some of these zones from you, it means that they're leaving some of the more combat-oriented ones in the tactics zone for sure. And that's going to be really good for you as a Lannister player to have as well if your opponent's really not doing much with those in order to try and dodge this card, which I don't think they're going to. I don't think people are going to try and actively stop you from doing something like playing Subjugation of Power, but every time they want to try and make an activation that relies on the abilities of their unit or the tactics cards that they're holding in their hand, Subjugation of Power can really shut them down. It's almost like Subjugation of Power became like another counterplot. It doesn't outright stop the card from being used ever, like how Counterplot does, but it does stop that card from being useful when your opponent wants it to. It can really help switch the advantage in the game, and I think it's a pretty good addition to the Lannister deck, especially considering all of the balance changes that have happened in 1.7. There's no way that Paid Mutiny could have existed in its old iteration in this version of the game, but I think they did really well with altering it to where it still kind of has that same impact and power in the game, and I think this is going to be one that people are going to have to watch out for when they roll up against a Lannister player. So I think I've done a decent job kind of explaining my reasoning for thinking that the Lannisters kind of convey this sense of control through political intrigue and fear-mongering, right? It's maybe not as much as something like a Bolton player would in terms of the fear spreading business, but the Lannisters for me, they are difficult to talk about without having to kind of like construct that narrative around these cards to kind of explain what the models are doing that kind of translates to the game. Lannisters are probably the faction that I play the least, so looking at the tactics deck and kind of bouncing off my experience with Lannisters, maybe there might be some things that I'm missing. If you feel like there is something that I missed in my discussion in terms of like how I feel about the Lannisters, feel free to put it in the comments below, because I do want these videos to kind of serve as a springboard for players going into 2021 that kind of helps them get acquainted with their new faction. And it isn't so much new that it's a new faction they just picked up, but I do feel like a lot of these factions are you're kind of learning them from the ground up. And the Lannisters are definitely one that's hard to get your head around when you look at them at first, because a lot of their cards they have more impact on the table than in the headspace. So with something like the Starks, it's really easy to see the immediate payoff when you look at a card. But when you think about something like Counterplot, you're like, yes, this is a pretty powerful card. I get it, but it's not always likely to go off, or it's not there's a opportunity for failure with rolling the die for that. And if your opponent's taking the crown zone, you don't get the chance to re-roll it. It can be pretty rough. Or maybe you need to counterplot something before you've taken that crown. So it looks like those cards are harder to justify when you don't have the context of the game, whereas when you play something like this against a rush of aggression, you're really stopping that person from being able to do what they want and taking that resource away from them. And that's not something that is extremely common in A Song of Ice and Fire, and the Lannisters seem to have a couple iterations of this to kind of make it so that your opponent's stuff is rendered obsolete for at least that quick interaction. So I think that it's one of those factions that's just kind of, you have to put it on the table and play it a bunch to get used to it, especially with the units themselves having a lot of ways of interacting with morale tests and being a little bit more on the control-y and not so much putting the pedal to the metal in the combat department. But I think that this was a good overview in terms of just kind of giving you a sense of what the Lannisters are doing in this new world of 2021.